The quietness that enveloped Windsor Castle on that specific morning was not the peaceful stillness of a routine day, but rather a heavy, suffocating silence that signaled an impending storm before anyone could fully comprehend what was about to unfold. Deep within the fortified walls of the ancient royal residence, standard procedures were supposedly underway as an official audit team gathered in the grand drawing room to catalog and process the immense, complex estate left behind by the late Queen Elizabeth II. However, beneath this surface of administrative normalcy, a highly sensitive and dangerous secret was unraveling because Princess, and known throughout her entire life as the most steadfast and no-nonsense member of the royal family, had just received an urgent, clandestine tip-off from none other than her late mother's former legal secretary. This insider had flagged a bizarre, highly irregular entry in the estate archives, a glaring discrepancy between the official legal documentation and what the entire family, as well as the nation, knew to be the true final wishes of the longest reigning monarch in modern history. And is not a person who waits for bureaucratic permission, nor is she someone who calls a committee meeting to politely deliberate whether a potential crisis warrants investigation. Her instinct has always been to act swiftly, decisively, and without regard for diplomatic sensitivities when the integrity of the crown is at stake. Slipping away from the bustling corridors without drawing the attention of the courtiers or security details, she navigated a network of cold, dimly lit subterranean passageways that felt as though they had remained untouched and forgotten since long before her mother's historic coronation. Her footsteps echoed faintly against the ancient stone walls as she descended deeper into the underbelly of Windsor Castle, eventually arriving at a sealed iron gate leading into a long-lost, restricted archive chamber that time itself seemed to have abandoned. Inside this dusty, cold room, sitting precariously on old oak shelves heavily layered with decades of grime, sat a single document folder that looked alarmingly clean, pristine, and entirely out of place, bearing the label of the Royal Testament of 2022. The moment Princess Anne opened that folder, the entire foundational narrative of the royal succession began to completely disintegrate because what lay inside was not a single, definitive copy of her mother's final wishes, but rather two separate, competing legal documents. The first document bore the familiar, elegant signature of Queen Elizabeth in noticeably fading ink, officially dated several months prior to her passing in Scotland. The second document, however, was written in fresh ink, handwritten with a striking, alarmingly recent neatness that immediately set off alarms in Anne's mind. Upon closer inspection, the signatures on both papers appeared virtually identical at a superficial glance, but Anne possessed an intimate, lifelong familiarity with her mother's handwriting, having analyzed her correspondence, official state papers, and personal notes for over half a century. She immediately detected that the weight of the pen strokes on the second document was completely wrong. The fluid curves of the letters felt unnaturally forced, and the deliberate pressure applied to the parchment was entirely inconsistent with the frail yet deliberate hand of the late queen. This was a sophisticated, highly calculated forgery that would take handwriting experts weeks to dissect. Yet, Anne's protective instincts allowed her to spot the deception instantly. As her eyes scanned the lines of this newly emerged, suspicious text, the true motive behind the forgery became blindingly obvious because while the names of Catherine, William, and even Harry were mentioned in minor, symbolic capacities, the name of Camilla appeared repeatedly with aggressive, unprecedented prominence. Vast historic estates, invaluable heirloom jewelry collections, ancient sovereign rights, extensive land grants, and highly restricted royal items that had been meticulously and fairly balanced across generations to maintain stability were suddenly, aggressively tilted in one single direction. And knew her mother to be a woman of absolute precision, someone who viewed the preservation of the monarchy's delicate equilibrium as her ultimate sacred duty, and it was instantly clear that this newly uncovered document did not reflect her mother's selfless voice, but rather the unchecked, ruthless ambition of an outsider wearing the late queen's signature like a weapon. Standing alone in the dim light of the vault, Princess Anne's hands began to shake, not from a sense of vulnerability or fear, but from a profound, burning anger that consumed her as she realized the sheer scale of the betrayal occurring within her own family's walls. She knew with absolute certainty that she needed to secure this evidence, leave the vault immediately, and warn Prince William and King Charles before this massive conspiracy could be permanently covered up or enacted by those responsible. But just as she turned her body toward the heavy iron exit, a soft, distinct rustling sound echoed from the dark shadows of the corridor behind her, sending a chill through the stagnant air. A silhouette emerged from the darkness, and as the weak light from the vault's entrance illuminated the figure, and found herself staring directly into the eyes of Camilla, who was standing motionless in the hidden corridor, holding an elegant fountain pen. The imagery was undeniable, looking like a scene pulled from a psychological thriller, as the current queen consort was discovered in a restricted underground archive, holding the exact instrument required to alter a legal document in real time. Instead of displaying a normal human reaction of panic, guilt, or embarrassment of being caught in such a compromising position, Camilla let out a soft, carefully rehearsed gasp, immediately attempting to project an aura of innocent surprise. With a smile that appeared entirely practiced and hollow, she smoothly claimed that she had merely ventured down into the archives to personally ensure that all historical records were perfectly organized and tidy before the official auditing team arrived downstairs. She then uttered a sentence that made the situation infinitely worse, softly reminding of how easily things can be tragically misunderstood in a house as complex as the palace. This was not a genuine explanation, nor was it even a clever lie. It was the calculated response of someone who had mentally prepared for the exact moment they might get caught, believing they could charm or manipulate their way out of any accusation. Princess Anne, however, had absolutely no patience for royal games, and her response cut through the freezing air like a razor blade, demanding to know how holding a fountain pen directly over a deceased monarch's will could ever be classified as a simple misunderstanding. Anne's fierce gaze dropped to the pages that Camilla had been handling, and her heart stopped when she noticed that one specific signature line on the document still gleamed with completely wet ink. Someone had just freshly penned the signature Elizabeth R., but the letters were far too perfect, too deliberate, and entirely lacking the natural imperfections of the late Queen's true handwriting. This was no longer a theoretical suspicion about a historical crime that might have taken place weeks ago in secret. This was a treasonous act unfolding in real time, right before her eyes, and the perpetrator was standing less than 2 feet away from her. Before the confrontation could escalate further, a royal security officer suddenly appeared at the heavy entrance of the vault, likely drawn to the area by the echo of their tense, elevated voices, and turned toward the guard, fully expecting royal protocol to take over, expecting the officer to secure the room and secure the documents under strict lock and key. However, before Anne could speak, Camilla calmly raised her hand with absolute authority, asserting that everything was perfectly under control and that they were simply finishing up their review. To Anne's absolute horror, the officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, bowed his head respectfully, turned around, and walked completely away from the vault. It was a terrifying revelation that sent shockwaves through Anne's understanding of the palace hierarchy, forcing her to realize that the security apparatus was now taking direct orders from Camilla over the Princess Royal herself. Why did Camilla possess such immense, unwavering confidence that she could dismiss security and handle a crisis of this magnitude on her own terms? It was clear that the dynamics of power within the palace walls had silently, drastically shifted long before anyone had ever walked into the vault that morning. Stepping forward with fierce determination, Anne looked Camilla dead in the eye and stated with absolute finality that she was going straight to Charles, because the king needed to know exactly what was happening to his mother's legacy before another minute passed. For the very first time since the confrontation began, a flash of genuine, unvarnished panic crossed Camilla's face, and she reached out, whispering a desperate plea for, and not to involve the king just yet. This desperate plea hung heavily in the damp air of the vault, serving as a fascinating and damning admission of guilt, Because if everything was truly legitimate, there would be absolutely no reason to hide the truth from King Charles. Knowing that time was running out and that the palace security could no longer be fully trusted to protect the evidence, it made a tactical decision. She did not go to Charles first, but instead took the forged documents directly to Prince William, changing the entire trajectory of the royal crisis forever. When Princess and deliberately bypassed the traditional hierarchy and carried the fragile evidence of treason straight into the private quarters of Prince William, the entire trajectory of the royal crisis shifted from a quiet internal suspicion into an explosive confrontation of monumental proportions. As she spread the two contrasting wills across the polished mahogany surface of his desk, one genuinely old and bearing the fading elegance of history, the other alarmingly pristine and carrying the unmistakable stench of recent forgery. William's reaction was not one of shock, denial, or even mild confusion. Instead, a chilling, absolute, and barely contained rage instantly radiated from the future king, filling the expansive room with a heavy tension that made the air feel suffocating. William did not need a team of highly paid forensic handwriting experts or legal scholars to explain what he was looking at. He possessed the intuitive, unbreakable bond of a grandson who had sat by the late Queen's side just weeks before her passing, listening intimately to her final reflections on duty, legacy, and the heavy burden of the crown. He vividly remembered his grandmother's voice, frail but resolute, as she spoke at length about the paramount importance of absolute truth and the critical role that Catherine would play in stabilizing the future of the monarchy. And in all those deeply personal final conversations, the Queen had never once mentioned fundamentally altering her will to elevate a woman whose loyalty she had privately deemed to be strictly conditional. As William's fingers slowly traced the unfamiliar, forced curves of the signature on the newly fabricated document, a profound sense of personal insult washed over him. Because the forgery was not just a legal crime. It was a grotesque insult to his grandmother's meticulous nature, lacking the distinct, delicate touch that had guided the British Empire for 70 years. The fabricated pages repeatedly and aggressively inserted Camilla's name into clauses that granted her sweeping control over historic land grants, priceless royal heirloom collections, and unprecedented executive privileges that were designed to permanently tilt the balance of power for her own selfish benefit. Unable to hold back the storm brewing inside him, William looked directly at his aunt with fire in his eyes and declared that Camilla was attempting to greedily rewrite royal history, raising his voice so powerfully that it echoed through the heavy oak doors, vowing that this fabricated atrocity would never be allowed to stand. And then, as if summoned by a theatrical cue in a perfectly choreographed tragedy, Camilla walked into the room with an entrance so carefully timed that it violently suggested she knew exactly what was being uncovered and had meticulously rehearsed her defensive strategy. Feigning a sickeningly sweet expression of motherly concern, she attempted to gaslight the two senior royals, smoothly suggesting that they were completely overreacting to a simple administrative misunderstanding and that their hysteria was entirely unwarranted. But her calculated words acted like gasoline thrown onto an open flame, instantly fueling William's explosive fury as he shot back without a second of hesitation, obliterating her facade by directly accusing her of forging his grandmother's sacred final wishes and explicitly stating that she had finally crossed a line from which there could be no return. Before William could unleash the full extent of his wrath, and expertly intervened as the pragmatic anchor of the family, raising her hands to de-escalate the immediate shouting match, warning them that allowing this to devolve into a chaotic screaming match would solve nothing. William, completely out of patience and disgusted by the decades of subtle manipulation, favoritism, and schemes that had slowly undermined the Queen's legacy piece by piece, fiercely warned Camilla that if she thought this monumental fraud could be swept under the palace rugs, she was dead wrong, threatening to hand the entire matter over to the criminal investigators at Scotland Yard. At the mention of police involvement, and paused, acutely aware that launching a formal criminal investigation into the Queen Consort would trigger an apocalyptic constitutional scandal that could irreparably shatter public trust and potentially destroy the very institution they were desperately trying to protect. Speaking softly but with ironclad authority, and insisted that they must present this catastrophic evidence to King Charles first, giving the monarch the opportunity to manage the crisis before it descended into a destructive public legal battle, prompting William to turn on his heel and storm out of the room without uttering another word, the sheer fury of his exit echoing violently in his heavy footsteps. When Anne and William finally tracked down King Charles, they did not find a man ready to govern. They found a deeply conflicted son isolated in his dimly lit study, staring blankly ahead while holding a heavily sealed, aged envelope written in his late mother's distinct handwriting. The heavy parchment was unequivocally marked with a strict directive to be opened only by her immediate successor, and it seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in the king's trembling hands. When Anne gently pressed her brother on why he had left such a crucial final message unopened since the state funeral, Charles hesitated, his voice breaking as he left his thoughts unfinished, murmuring that their mother did not want it read unless a specific conflict arose. Seizing the opportunity to position herself as the calm, indispensable presence, Camilla quietly slipped into the study, attempting to exude an aura of supportive tranquility. But William immediately shattered the illusion by loudly accusing her of committing the ultimate betrayal against the family's fundamental trust. Feeling completely cornered by the escalating warfare between his heir and his wife, Charles finally broke the ancient wax seal with shaking, reluctant hands, and the contents of that hidden letter struck the room with the force of a physical blow. The Queen's genuine, unvarnished final thoughts explicitly named Catherine as the ultimate symbolic heir to her sprawling personal estate, while Camilla was not merely minimized or reduced in status. She was deliberately and entirely left out of the most important private inheritances. As Anne felt her darkest suspicions permanently validated and William recognized the true, uncompromising voice of his beloved grandmother, Charles remained paralyzed in a suffocating silence, visibly torn apart between his blind loyalty to his wife and the unavoidable duty to honor his mother's final, undeniable commands. But the revelations were far from over, because driven by an unshakable instinct and remembering her mother's cryptic warning that some dangerous truths require better hiding places, and later returned alone to the Queen's most private sanctuary. Searching beneath a massive, historical portrait, she unlocked a hidden wooden ceremonial chest and discovered the true, genuine, and signed will, drafted just weeks before the monarch's passing, an ironclad document that named Catherine as the sole custodian of Elizabeth's personal jewels and strictly limited Camilla's future role to a purely ceremonial queen consort entirely stripped of any executive royal power. When Anne confidently presented this undeniable proof to the highest-ranking members of the Royal Council, and elite handwriting experts definitively verified its authenticity. The true, venomous nature of the forgery was brutally exposed, forcing a humiliated Camilla to quietly and immediately withdraw from the inner circles of palace operations. However, just when the royal family believed they had successfully contained the crisis behind closed doors, the situation escalated from a private nightmare into a global catastrophe, because Camilla, acting out of sheer panic and desperate self-preservation, preemptively leaked her altered, forged version of the will directly to the ruthless British press. Before the Buckingham Palace communications team could even attempt to control the narrative, major international tabloids published the fabricated document as the absolute truth, proudly broadcasting what they falsely claimed were the Queen's genuine last wishes to a stunned global audience. This reckless, vindictive act triggered instantaneous, nationwide outrage as the palace press office was caught completely blind and off guard, unable to release an approved statement as absolute chaos erupted across every major media platform. Social media networks were instantly flooded with side-by-side forensic comparisons between the leaked document and the Queen's historical signatures, with amateur sleuths and professional experts alike quickly pointing out the glaring, clumsy mistakes in Camilla's desperately fabricated version. The British public, fiercely protective of the late Queen's memory, erupted in absolute anger. Leading newspaper editorials openly labeled the act as downright treasonous, while massive crowds of furious protesters began gathering outside the palace gates demanding immediate transparency and accountability. It was universally dubbed the most scandalous, damaging act of royal forgery in modern European history, forcing a visibly shaken King Charles to finally confront Camilla in a devastating private meeting, where he tragically admitted that his own agonizing suspicions about her ambition had been silently growing for months. Meanwhile, rising above the dirt and the noise, Catherine made her very first public appearance since the catastrophic leak, stepping out of a royal vehicle wearing a highly significant, priceless diamond brooch taken directly from the late Queen's most exclusive private collection. That single, dazzling piece of jewelry was not just a fashion choice. It was a loud, undeniable, and perfectly executed statement of absolute legitimacy, serving as a devastating, silent criticism of Camilla's desperate greed. Overnight, the carefully constructed public relations image of Camilla as a misunderstood, dedicated servant to the crown completely evaporated into thin air, permanently replaced by the dark, undeniable shadow of a ruthless scandal creator who had dared to tamper with the sacred legacy of Britain's greatest monarch. Just when the inner circles of the royal family believed that the devastating media fallout had reached its absolute peak, a startling new revelation surfaced late one night inside the heavily guarded confines of Windsor Castle, transforming the entire legal dispute into an undeniable matter of ultimate historical justice. Princess, and, driven by her relentless pursuit of absolute truth, uncovered a hidden recording carefully preserved deep within the private personal archives of late Queen Elizabeth, a pristine piece of audio evidence that was explicitly never intended to be uncovered during routine estate audits or weaponized by palace courtiers. Tucked away securely between weathered historical journals and personal wartime letters was an old, unmarked wooden box explicitly bearing the Queen's private royal monogram, completely separate from the official, public-facing state records. Inside this fragile container lay a single, well-preserved cassette tape, meticulously labeled in the unmistakable, elegant handwriting of the late monarch, with a haunting, simple instruction that directed it to be opened only if severe internal questions arose. Sitting entirely alone in the suffocating silence of the middle of the night, and felt a heavy wave of unease wash over her as she placed the tape inside an archival player and pressed the play button with a trembling finger. Instantly, her mother's distinct, clear, and deeply intimate voice filled the empty room, carrying a maternal warmth combined with an unyielding sovereign authority that made it feel as though the late Queen was standing right beside her. The Queen began by calmly stating that she had watched the changing dynamics within the palace walls unfold quietly over the years, explicitly articulating her growing concern regarding Camilla's aggressive, calculating influence over the family structure. She firmly clarified that she did not harbor bitterness or personal resentment, but rather a profound, strategic worry for the long-term survival of the crown itself, noting that while she accepted Charles's personal choices as a husband, she could never allow fleeting emotional feelings to overshadow the sacred constitutional rules of the monarchy. Then, after a long, deliberate, and incredibly heavy pause, the late Queen uttered a historic sentence that completely shattered any remaining legal claims Camilla possessed, revealing that she had made a solemn promise to Princess Diana before the world ever truly understood the depth of her suffering, vowing that the ultimate future of this historic crown would rest securely with a woman of absolute duty and grace, a woman she explicitly named as Catherine. The air in the room grew noticeably colder as the Queen's voice became remarkably firm and unwavering, issuing a final, devastating directive that if any confusion arose after her passing, or if a newly manufactured will suddenly appear that favored others unfairly, the family must know immediately that it was not her true voice or her legitimate legacy. She explicitly warned that those who attempted to alter her final testaments did not serve the ancient institution of the monarchy, but were merely serving their own unchecked, ruthless ambition, ending her final message with a direct command to the listeners to never let them win, and froze in absolute astonishment, realizing that her mother had possessed the incredible foresight to anticipate this exact betrayal, leaving behind an unassailable piece of proof that unmasked the forgery once and for all. Armed with this explosive recording, and immediately arranged an emergency meeting, bringing Prince William directly into a private room to confront King Charles behind tightly closed doors, removing all staff to ensure absolute secrecy as just a loyal daughter and a fierce heir faced their conflicted father. As the undeniable voice of Queen Elizabeth filled the room, Charles sat completely motionless, his face turning pale as a profound mixture of devastating grief and crushing guilt washed over him, realizing that his blind loyalty to his wife had caused him to completely ignore his mother's repeated, silent warnings. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the room was deafening, prompting him to quietly step forward and declare with ironclad finality that while the monarchy does not need to be perfect, it can never survive absolute betrayal from within its own walls. William, refusing to compromise on his grandmother's legacy or his mother's memory, delivered a fierce, non-negotiable ultimatum to his father, stating that if immediate executive action was not taken to strip Camilla of her usurped influence, he would personally bypass palace control and release both the recording and the original unsigned will directly to the global public. Realizing that he had no choice but to completely surrender to the undeniable truth, King Charles slowly and reluctantly nodded his head in agreement. And by the following morning, Buckingham Palace issued a definitive announcement confirming that Queen Elizabeth's authentic wishes would strictly guide the future of the crown. While Camilla was allowed to retain her purely ceremonial title for diplomatic purposes, she lost every ounce of her formal power and institutional influence, triggering a mixed but deeply relieved reaction from a public that felt order and morality had finally been restored. Yet, the final fulfillment of the late Queen's personal wishes was only fully realized when an unmarked courier box arrived from Balmoral, containing a final personal keepsake wrapped in plain cloth, addressed exclusively to Princess, and, upon opening it, and discovered a deeply personal diary entry dated August 31st, 1997, the fateful day Princess Diana passed away, where Elizabeth had poured out her raw grief and detailed her profound regret over things left unsaid. Beneath the diary lay a beautiful gold locket containing miniature portraits of both Diana and Elizabeth side by side, symbolizing their permanently intertwined legacies and serving as a silent passing of the family's moral guardianship to Anne, who had successfully protected the truth. Meanwhile, entirely devoid of any official ceremony, public fanfare, or royal honors, Camilla quietly exited the palace gates through the rear eastern entrance, marking the definitive, unceremonious end of her ambition. As her vehicle drove away into oblivion, the nation did not mourn her departure, but rather reflected deeply on how close the monarchy had come to losing its very soul, opening a glorious new chapter where Queen Elizabeth's true, uncorrupted wishes lived on securely in the hearts of the family she trusted.